we have talked about quite a number of Regia Marina vessels at this point, which I hope you guys have enjoyed this change of pace from the other nations that we have usually covered on this channel. Now, when it comes to the Capitani Romani class, their story would start in the mid-1930s as a new class of oceanic scouts, which would differentiate them from the previous Navigatori class, which were classified as light scouts. The final design work for these new ships would come about in 1935 and in 1936 by a pair of naval designers. Now, just to continue to beat my drum about the Franco-Italian naval rivalry during this time period, and a quote from Mussolini's Navy, a reference guide to the Regia Marina, 1930 to 1945, by Maurizio Brescia, quote, repeating a pattern that had been established earlier during the 1930s, this new class of ships was intended as a response to similar French construction programs, and in this specific case, to 6 large and fast destroyers of the Le Fantasque class, speed 37 knots, armed with 5 5.4-inch guns, and the subsequent and similar and even larger destroyers of the Mogador class. End quote. Originally, there would be 12 ships planned for this class, all named after Roman military generals or emperors. They would be commonly referred to as the Capitani Romani class or the Attilio Regolo class, as it was the first ship to be commissioned. The main builder or contractor for this class would be the OTO Yard of Leghorn, which would base the project off its own design, the destroyer Tashkent, built for the Soviet Navy in 1937 to 1939. Many of the ship's aspects would be incorporated into the design of the new class of oceanic scouts. 4 ships, including the Attilio Regolo, would be built by OTO Leghorn. The other 8 ships were given to various other builders. The Tashkent's design would be made slightly larger, and the hull was now flush-decked, with a large deck house incorporating barbettes of B and C turrets, which would be partially flush with the hull sides below the conning tower. Speed would be seen as a necessity, so the power plant was quite similar to the Tashkent's. Moving on swiftly to the design of the class, they would have a standard displacement of 3,084 tons and a displacement of 5,420 tons full load. The machinery would consist of 4 boilers and 2 shaft-geared turbines, giving the ships 110,000 horsepower with a top speed of 38 knots and 40 knots on trials. Their armament would consist of 8 135mm or 5.3-inch 45 caliber guns and 4 twin turrets. Along with that, 8 37mm guns, 8 20mm guns, and 8 torpedo tubes and quadruple launchers, along with depth charges and the ability to lay mines. Of the ships that were built, there would be the Attilio Regolo, completed in May of 1942. She would be given to France in 1948, renamed the Chateau Renault, and eventually broken up in 1970. Next, the Giulio Germanico, which would be rebuilt in the mid-1950s and was renamed the San Marco by the Marina Militare Italiana, and eventually stricken in February of 1972. The Pompeo Magno would be completed in June of 1943. It was allotted to France, but was retained by the Italian Navy, and was rebuilt in the 1950s and commissioned as the San Giorgio, and would be eventually stricken in 1982. Finally, the Scipione Africano, which would be completed in April of 1943, and was given to France in 1948, and renamed the Guichen, which would be broken up eventually in the 1960s. The Capitani Romani class could be considered one of the much-beloved super-destroyers of the 1930s that we have become acquainted with on this channel over the past couple of months. Although being large vessels, and especially for destroyer standards, they did not have a whole lot in the way of armor protection. Even with this in mind, they would be considered small light cruisers. We have talked about these distinctions before, and I would like to hear your guys' thoughts on this class's classification. Especially with their twin long-barrel 135mm guns, they would certainly be effective against opponents of similar-sized ships and characteristics. As for their wartime careers, the vessels, due to them entering service so late in the war for the Regia Marina, they would be rather limited. Now, only 3 ships were commissioned into the Regia Marina: the Attilio Regolo, Pompeo Magno, and Scipio Africano. In early November of 1942, the Attilio Regolo would be torpedoed while making its way from Tarpini heading towards Palermo by the British submarine Unruffled, losing her bow for her troubles, and it was towed to La Spezia, where she would be given the bow of her incomplete sister, Caio Mario. In July of 1943, the Scipio Africano would battle against 4 British torpedo boats, sinking 1 and damaging 2 others, all while going at 37 knots. She would also escort the corvette Bayonetta with the king and royal family aboard, fleeing from Pescara and Ortona to Brindisi to the Allied-controlled part of the country. The Attilio Regolo would leave La Spezia on September 9, 1943, along with the other La Spezia-based ships, and would head for Malta. On their way to be interred, she would remain in the area off northwestern Sardinia to rescue survivors of the battleship Roma after she was sunk, along with destroyers and torpedo boats, where she would make her way to the Spanish Balearic Islands, where she would be interred until the end of the war. As previously discussed, the incomplete machinery of the Cornelio Silla and the Paolo Emilio were fitted to the aircraft carrier Aquila. The vast majority of the incomplete ships of the class were either removed from the building ways during the war or scrapped in 1946 and 1947. As previously mentioned, the Scipione Africano, Attilo Regolo, and the Pompeo Magno would be given to France as war reparations, with the first two actually seeing service with the Marine Nationale, being modernized and fit with French weapons and electronics, seeing service into the 1960s. The Pompeo Magno would be stripped of equipment and machinery by the Marine Nationale, but would remain in Italian hands, and the new Marina Militare Italiana would rebuild her as a destroyer in Genoa between 1953 and 1955, being recommissioned as the San Giorgio. She would carry 3 twin 5-inch 38 caliber turrets from the United States and 40mm Bofors guns, with Italian and US electronics. The Giulio Germanico would be refloated at Castellamare di Stabia after World War II and would be rebuilt in the 1950s along similar lines as the San Giorgio and be renamed the San Marco, serving until February of 1972. The San Giorgio, however, would be modernized in 1963 again, with the machinery being updated, giving her a top speed now of 28 knots, but would only retain 2 twin 5-inch 38 caliber turrets, but 2 76mm 62 caliber OTL Alagarto guns would be installed. The funnels would be modernized as well. She would serve mostly as a training ship until 1982, where she was stricken from service and immediately broken up. I hope you guys have enjoyed this look at our other interesting class of ships. They really embody several aspects that I enjoy as a naval history nerd. One, they can cause somewhat of a controversy in their designation, as either a small light cruiser or a very large destroyer. Along with that, the Franco-Italian naval rivalry that I have really been beating like a dead horse over the past couple weeks. Not to mention that some of the ships would see very long service lives, with either the new reformed Italian Navy or the French Navy they were given to as war reparations. Another thing that I would like to touch on would be the Tashkent, as I definitely think that her story would be something that would be interesting to talk about in a future video, as I have not done a video on the Soviet Navy, unless you count the video on the Ganget class, which the less said about the better. But the Tashkent's design and history is something that I will have to take a closer look into, which brings me to my final point. I'm looking for books to get me started on Russian and Soviet naval history, as I really don't even know where to start, so if anyone has any suggestions, please put them in the comments down below. Anyway, please remember to like and subscribe, as it will help the channel to grow.